In the world of international diplomacy, a single gesture can spark a crisis that echoes through palace halls and embassy corridors for decades. What happens when an ancient tradition of honor collides with modern political maneuvering? When a foreign officer's simple command threatens to unravel centuries of royal protocol? The answer lies in the unwavering stance of one royal guard whose refusal to bend would shake the very foundations of diplomatic relations and reveal the true meaning of loyalty, duty, and national pride. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his crimson tunic for the third time. The brass buttons gleamed like miniature suns against the fabric, each one polished to perfection during his pre-dawn preparation ritual. At 32 years old, Mitchell had served in the Queen's Guard for 8 years, but today felt different. Today carried an electric tension that made his skin prickle beneath the heavy woolen uniform. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock, just 2 hours away. Tourists were already gathering behind the ornate iron gates, their cameras ready to capture the spectacle of British pageantry that had remained unchanged for centuries. Children pressed their faces against the metal bars, their breath fogging the cold iron as they waited for the famous red-coated soldiers to begin their precise march. Mitchell's commanding officer, Captain Harrison Wells, approached with measured steps across the courtyard. His own uniform was immaculate, the gold braiding on his shoulders catching the autumn light. Wells had served the crown for 15 years, and his weathered face bore the subtle lines that came from years of maintaining perfect composure under public scrutiny. "Mitchell," Wells said, his voice carrying the crisp authority that had commanded respect from hundreds of guardsmen over the years. "We have visitors today. Representatives from a Moldovan embassy will be observing the ceremony." The announcement might have seemed routine to an outsider, but Mitchell understood the implications immediately. Foreign diplomatic observers meant heightened security protocols, additional scrutiny, and the ever-present possibility of international incidents arising from the smallest misunderstanding. The Queen's Guard had faced such challenges before, but each situation brought its own unique complexities. "How many in their party, sir?" Mitchell asked, his eyes scanning the courtyard perimeter where additional security personnel had begun to position themselves with practiced subtlety. "3 officials," Wells replied, consulting a leather-bound folder that contained the morning's briefings. "Ambassador Petrov, cultural attaché Volkov, and military liaison Colonel Andrei Kozlov. The colonel specifically requested permission to observe our procedures for a diplomatic report he's preparing." Mitchell nodded, filing away the information with a mental precision that had made him one of the most reliable guards in his unit. Foreign military observers were not uncommon, particularly for nations seeking to understand British ceremonial traditions for their own state functions. However, something in Captain Wells' tone suggested this visit carried additional weight. The captain continued, "Colonel Kozlov served as a paratrooper before his diplomatic appointment. He's known for his direct approach to military matters. The Foreign Office has emphasized the importance of maintaining cordial relations during this visit." As Wells spoke, Mitchell caught sight of movement near the main entrance to the palace. 3 figures in dark overcoats were being escorted by a pair of palace officials, their formal attire marking them clearly as the expected diplomatic delegation. Even from a distance, Mitchell could identify which of the 3 was Colonel Kozlov. The man's bearing was unmistakably military, shoulders squared, head held high, with the kind of purposeful stride that spoke of decades spent in uniform. Colonel Andrei Kozlov was 54 years old, though his rigid posture and alert eyes made him appear younger. His thick gray hair was cut in the short, practical style favored by career soldiers, and his dark overcoat could not entirely conceal the impressive breadth of his shoulders. As a young man, he had served with distinction in his nation's elite airborne forces before transitioning into diplomatic service following the political changes that had reshaped Eastern Europe in the 1990s. The colonel's assignment to the Moldovan embassy in London was considered a prestigious posting, one that recognized both his military expertise and his growing reputation as a skilled negotiator. However, those who knew him well understood that beneath his diplomatic veneer lay the heart of a soldier who had never quite adapted to the subtle nuances of international protocol. As the diplomatic party drew closer, Mitchell observed the dynamics between the three visitors. Ambassador Petrov, a slight man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, moved with the careful, measured steps of a career diplomat. His every gesture seemed calculated to avoid offense, his smile practiced and professionally warm. Cultural attaché Volkov, younger and more animated, gestured frequently as he spoke, his enthusiasm for the upcoming ceremony evident in his animated expressions. But it was Colonel Kozlov who commanded attention without seeking it. His pale blue eyes missed nothing as they swept across the courtyard, taking in the positioning of guards, the layout of ceremonial routes, and the security arrangements with the automatic assessment of a trained military mind. There was something in his gaze that suggested he was evaluating more than mere ceremony. He was studying the British military tradition with the intensity of a professional soldier encountering an unfamiliar but respected adversary. The palace tour guide, a well-dressed woman in her 40s named Sarah Whitman, was explaining the historical significance of various architectural features as the group approached the area where the guard ceremony would take place. Her voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had delivered similar presentations hundreds of times, yet her awareness of her important guests kept her explanations more detailed than usual. The tradition of the Queen's Guard dates back to 1660, she was saying, when King Charles II first established the regiment following his restoration to the throne. The ceremonial aspects we see today have evolved over centuries, but the core principles of duty, honor, and service to the crown remain unchanged. Colonel Kozlov listened with the attention of a student, occasionally asking questions that revealed both his military background and his genuine interest in understanding British traditions. His English was excellent, though accented with the distinctive Eastern European cadence that marked his origins. "In my country," he remarked to Ambassador Petrov as they paused near the guardhouse, "our ceremonial units also maintain ancient traditions. But I'm curious to observe how the British balance historical pageantry with modern security requirements." The observation was innocent enough, but Mitchell caught the undertone of professional assessment in the colonel's voice. This was not merely a cultural exchange. It was one military professional studying the methods of another, seeking to understand both strengths and potential vulnerabilities in the British approach to ceremonial security. As 10 o'clock approached, the guardsmen began their final preparations for the ceremony. Mitchell checked his rifle for the fourth time that morning, ensuring that the weapon was properly cleaned and positioned. The rifle was unloaded during ceremonial duties, but its symbolic importance demanded that it be maintained in perfect condition. Every piece of equipment, from the distinctive bearskin hat to the polished boots, had to meet the exacting standards that had been established over centuries of royal service. The tourists outside the gates had grown to a substantial crowd, their excited chatter creating a low murmur of anticipation that drifted across the courtyard. Tour groups from a dozen different countries mixed with local residents and school children on educational visits, all drawn by the prospect of witnessing one of Britain's most famous traditions. Mitchell could see camera crews from several television networks setting up their equipment at designated positions outside the palace grounds. The changing of the guard ceremony was a regular feature in travel documentaries and news segments about British culture, its visual appeal, and historical significance making it ideal content for international broadcast. Inside the palace, the diplomatic party had been provided with an excellent vantage point for observing the ceremony. A temporary viewing area had been established on a raised platform that offered clear sight lines to the main ceremonial route while maintaining appropriate distance from the active participants. Colonel Kozlov stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his attention focused entirely on the guardsmen as they completed their preparations. There was something almost predatory in his concentration, though not in a hostile sense. Rather, it was the focused attention of a professional soldier studying a respected military tradition with the goal of complete understanding. "Your guards maintain impressive discipline," he commented to the palace guide, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. "In my military experience, such ceremonial precision requires countless hours of training and absolute dedication to perfection." Sarah Whitman smiled at the compliment. "Indeed, Colonel. Our guardsmen train extensively for these duties. Many have served in active combat roles before being selected for ceremonial assignments. The combination of military expertise and ceremonial precision is considered essential for representing the crown. The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. Combat vétéran. I had assumed this was primarily a ceremonial posting for soldiers without field experience. Quite the opposite, Captain Wells interjected, having approached the viewing area to ensure the diplomatic party had everything they needed. Sergeant Mitchell, for example, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. Many of our ceremonial soldiers bring extensive operational experience to their duties. Colonel Kozlov's gaze shifted to Mitchell with renewed interest. The knowledge that the guardsman was a combat veteran added a new dimension to his assessment of the British ceremonial system. In his own military experience, the most elite units often combined both operational capability and ceremonial excellence, creating soldiers who could transition seamlessly between combat readiness and formal representation. The clock tower chimed 10:30, signaling that the ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. Around the courtyard, final preparations were reaching their conclusion. The band had taken their positions, their instruments gleaming in the morning sunlight. The incoming guard unit had completed their inspection and stood ready to begin their march from the nearby barracks. Mitchell felt the familiar surge of pride and responsibility that always accompanied these moments. The ceremony was more than mere pageantry. It was a living connection to centuries of military tradition, a demonstration of continuity and stability that represented the best of British values to the watching world. But today, with the presence of the foreign military observer, the weight of representation felt particularly significant. Every movement, every gesture, every aspect of the performance would be scrutinized and potentially reported back to foreign military establishments. The ceremony was no longer just a display for tourists. It had become an informal demonstration of British military excellence to a professional audience. The colonel continued his observation of the preparations, his trained eye noting details that would escape civilian observers. The spacing between guardsmen, the condition of their equipment, the subtle hand signals used for coordination, all of these elements provided insight into the level of training and discipline maintained by the Queen's Guard. Impressive organization, he murmured to Ambassador Petrov. There's clearly significant planning behind what appears to be a simple ceremony. The ambassador nodded agreement, though his own attention was focused more on the diplomatic implications of their visit than the military details that fascinated his colleague. For Petrov, the morning represented an opportunity to strengthen cultural ties between their nations, to demonstrate respect for British traditions while building relationships that could prove valuable in future negotiations. Cultural attaché Volkov was busy taking notes and photographs, documenting various aspects of the ceremony for inclusion in his upcoming report on British cultural institutions. His enthusiasm was genuine. He had studied British history extensively and was thrilled to witness one of its most famous traditions firsthand. As the minutes ticked toward 11 o'clock, the energy in the courtyard began to shift. The casual preparation atmosphere gave way to the focused intensity that preceded all formal military ceremonies. Guardsmen moved to their designated positions with practiced precision, their movements economical and purposeful. Mitchell adjusted his grip on his rifle and settled into the ready position that he had assumed hundreds of times before. His mind was clear, focused entirely on the ceremony ahead and his role in its flawless execution. Years of training had prepared him for this moment, and he was ready to demonstrate the excellence that the Queen's Guard was known for throughout the world. The tourist crowd outside the gates had grown to several hundred people, their excitement building as the ceremony approached. Children bounced on their parents' shoulders for better views, while adults checked their cameras and positioned themselves for optimal photo opportunities. Colonel Kozlov made one final adjustment to his position, ensuring he had an unobstructed view of the proceedings. His pale blue eyes were alert and focused, ready to observe every detail of the ceremony with the analytical mind of a professional soldier. What he would witness in the next hour would exceed his expectations and challenge his understanding of military protocol in ways he could never have anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of diplomatic courtesy and military tradition, though none of the participants yet suspected the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The clock tower's deep chimes resonated across Buckingham Palace as 11 o'clock arrived with ceremonial precision. The gathered crowd fell into an expectant hush, broken only by the distant sound of marching feet echoing off the surrounding buildings. The incoming guard unit was approaching from Wellington Barracks, their synchronized footsteps creating a rhythmic drumbeat that grew steadily louder. Sergeant Mitchell stood at attention in his designated position, his red tunic brilliant against the gray stone of the palace wall. Every detail of his appearance met the exacting standards that had been maintained by the Queen's Guard for centuries. His bearskin hat sat perfectly level, its height adding to his already impressive stature. The morning sun caught the brass fittings of his uniform, creating small points of light that emphasized the meticulous care he had taken in his preparation. From the diplomatic viewing area, Colonel Kozlov watched with intense concentration as the ceremony began to unfold. His years of military experience allowed him to appreciate subtleties that escaped civilian observers. The precise spacing between guardsmen, the exact timing of their movements, the seamless coordination between different elements of the ceremony, all spoke to a level of training and discipline that commanded professional respect. The band struck up the traditional march music, their instruments producing the crisp, martial sound that had accompanied British military ceremonies for generations. The melody was familiar to audiences around the world, its stirring cadence designed to inspire both participants and observers with a sense of pride and solemnity. Captain Wells observed the proceedings from his command position near the palace entrance, his experienced eye scanning for any detail that might require correction. The presence of foreign military observers always added an extra layer of pressure to these ceremonies, transforming routine pageantry into informal demonstrations of British military excellence. The incoming guard unit appeared at the main gates with perfect timing, their red tunics and bearskin hats creating a striking visual display against the ornate ironwork. Tourist cameras clicked rapidly as the guardsmen marched through the gates with mechanical precision, their rifles held at identical angles, their steps perfectly synchronized. Colonel Kozlov leaned forward slightly, his attention focused on the technical execution of the marching drill. In his own military career, he had participated in numerous ceremonial events, but he had never observed the British approach firsthand. The level of precision was remarkable, even by the standards of elite military units. Extraordinary discipline, he murmured to Ambassador Petrov, his voice carrying genuine admiration. The coordination required for such precision must demand extensive training. The ambassador nodded politely, though his own attention was divided between the ceremony and his awareness of the political implications of their visit. Recent diplomatic tensions between various European nations had made cultural exchanges like this one particularly important for maintaining positive international relationships. As the incoming guard unit reached the center of the courtyard, they executed a complex series of movements designed to position them for the formal exchange of responsibilities. Each guardsman moved with practiced certainty, their training evident in every gesture and step. The ceremony had been performed thousands of times before, but each execution demanded the same level of perfection as if it were the first. Mitchell remained motionless at his post, his role in this phase of the ceremony requiring absolute stillness and alertness. The tourists beyond the gates were now completely silent, recognizing instinctively that they were witnessing something significant and formal. Even the children had stopped their restless movement, caught up in the solemnity of the moment. The formal inspection of the incoming guard began with Captain Wells moving down the line of soldiers, examining each man's appearance and equipment with meticulous care. This was not mere ceremonial theater. The inspection served genuine military purposes, ensuring that every guardsman met the standards required for duty at one of the most important sites in the British Empire. Colonel Kozlov observed the inspection process with particular interest. In his own military experience, such reviews often revealed the true character of a unit and its leadership. The way Captain Wells conducted the examination, thorough but respectful, demanding but not demeaning, spoke to a military culture that balanced high standards with respect for individual soldiers. The inspection proceeded smoothly, each guardsman passing scrutiny without incident. Their uniforms were immaculate, their equipment properly maintained, their bearing appropriately military. The months of preparation and training that preceded assignment to the Queen's Guard were evident in every aspect of their presentation. As the formal portion of the ceremony continued, the diplomatic party maintained their observation with growing appreciation for the complexity of what they were witnessing. What had initially appeared to be a simple changing of personnel was revealing itself as an intricate display of military precision, historical tradition, and national pride. Cultural attaché Volkov was taking extensive notes, capturing details that would later be included in his report on British cultural institutions. The ceremony represented far more than military pageantry. It was a living demonstration of the values and traditions that had shaped British society for centuries. The band continued to provide musical accompaniment, their performance adding emotional depth to the visual spectacle. The traditional melodies had been composed specifically for such ceremonies, their stirring harmonies designed to evoke feelings of patriotism and respect for military service. As the inspection phase concluded, the ceremony moved into its next stage, the formal transfer of guard responsibilities. This was the moment when the outgoing guardsmen would be relieved of their posts and replaced by their incoming colleagues, a process that required precise timing and flawless execution. Captain Wells positioned himself at the center of the formation, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard as he began the traditional commands that would initiate the transfer process. Each word had been chosen for both its practical meaning and its historical significance, connecting the present ceremony to centuries of military tradition. The guardsmen responded to the commands with practiced precision, their movements sharp and economical. Years of training had prepared them for this moment, and they executed their roles with the confidence that came from complete mastery of their duties. Colonel Kozlov found himself increasingly impressed by what he was observing. The ceremony combined several elements that he recognized from his own military experience: precision drill, formal inspection, leadership demonstration, and symbolic representation of national values. However, the British approach integrated these elements with a level of sophistication that exceeded anything he had previously witnessed. The tourists beyond the gates watched in rapt attention, many of them recording the ceremony with their cameras, but most simply absorbing the experience with their full attention. The combination of visual pageantry, musical accompaniment, and historical significance created an atmosphere that transcended mere entertainment. As the formal transfer commands were given, Mitchell prepared for his own role in the ceremony. As one of the outgoing guardsmen, he would soon be relieved of his post by an incoming soldier. The process required precise timing and complete trust between participants. Any hesitation or uncertainty could disrupt the entire ceremony. The incoming guardsman who would replace Mitchell at his post was Corporal David Thompson, a 26-year-old veteran of the Royal Regiment of Scotland who had joined the Queen's Guard 6 months earlier. Thompson's background included combat service in Iraq and extensive training in both ceremonial duties and active military operations. Thompson approached Mitchell's position with measured steps, his own uniform immaculate and his bearing appropriately military. The two soldiers would execute a formal exchange that had been practiced countless times in training, but required perfect execution under the scrutiny of hundreds of observers. The moment of transfer arrived with ceremonial precision. Captain Wells gave the formal command, and Mitchell began the sequence of movements that would formally transfer his guard duties to Thompson. The process required several carefully coordinated actions: the exchange of positions, the transfer of responsibility, and the formal acknowledgement of the change. Colonel Kozlov watched this exchange with particular attention, recognizing it as the crucial moment when individual discipline and training would be most clearly demonstrated. In his own military experience, such transfers often revealed the true level of preparation and competence within a unit. The exchange proceeded flawlessly, with both Mitchell and Thompson executing their roles with practiced perfection. Their movements were economical and precise, their timing exact, their bearing appropriately military. The months of preparation for this duty were evident in every aspect of their performance. As Thompson assumed his post, Mitchell stepped back into formation with the other outgoing guardsmen. His role in the active ceremony was now complete, though he would remain at attention until the entire process concluded and his unit received formal dismissal. The ceremony continued through its remaining phases, each stage executed with the same level of precision and attention to detail. The band maintained their musical accompaniment. The commands were given with appropriate authority, and the guardsmen responded with mechanical perfection. Colonel Kozlov found himself developing a deeper appreciation for what he was witnessing. The ceremony was clearly more than symbolic pageantry. It was a demonstration of military values, training excellence, and institutional continuity that spoke to the strength and stability of British society. As the formal phases of the ceremony neared their conclusion, the atmosphere in the courtyard began to shift slightly. The intense focus required for the precision drill began to give way to the anticipation of completion. The guardsmen maintained their perfect bearing, but there was a subtle relaxation in the overall energy as the event moved toward its traditional ending. Captain Wells prepared to give the final commands that would officially conclude the ceremony and dismiss the outgoing guard unit. The incoming guardsmen were now fully responsible for palace security, and the outgoing unit would return to barracks for rest and preparation for their next assignment. The tourists beyond the gates began to sense that the ceremony was approaching its conclusion, their cameras ready to capture the final moments of the spectacle. Many had been standing for more than an hour, but their attention remained focused on the courtyard drama that had held their interest throughout the morning. Ambassador Petrov checked his watch, noting that the ceremony was proceeding exactly on schedule. The precision timing was another indication of the thorough preparation that had preceded the event. In his diplomatic experience, such attention to detail often reflected the overall competence and reliability of the institutions involved. But it was at this moment, as the ceremony approached its traditional conclusion, that the unexpected intervention occurred that would transform a routine diplomatic observation into an international incident. Colonel Kozlov, impressed by what he had witnessed, and perhaps influenced by his own military background, decided to make a gesture that he intended as a compliment to British military excellence. Stepping forward from the diplomatic viewing area, the colonel approached the edge of the ceremonial space. His movement was noticed immediately by Captain Wells, who turned to address the foreign observer with appropriate diplomatic courtesy. "Colonel Kozlov," Wells said, his voice maintaining the formal tone required by the circumstances, "I trust you have found the ceremony informative." The colonel nodded with genuine enthusiasm. "Most impressive, Captain. Your soldiers demonstrate exceptional discipline and training. In my military experience, such precision is rare and commendable." Wells accepted the compliment with appropriate grace, pleased that the diplomatic party had been favorably impressed by the ceremony. The positive reaction would undoubtedly be included in their report to the Moldovan government, potentially strengthening cultural and military ties between the two nations. But then Colonel Kozlov made the gesture that would change everything. Drawing on his own military experience and perhaps misunderstanding the protocols governing interaction with the Queen's Guard during ceremonial duties, he decided to offer what he intended as a respectful military salute to the assembled guardsmen. "Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel called out, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Your performance was exemplary. Please accept my salute as recognition of your military excellence." The colonel raised his hand in a formal military salute, his bearing and expression conveying genuine respect and admiration for what he had witnessed. In his own military tradition, such gestures between professional soldiers were appropriate and appreciated regardless of national boundaries. But for Sergeant Mitchell, standing at attention in the Queen's Guard formation, the situation presented an impossible dilemma that would test every aspect of his training, loyalty, and understanding of military protocol. The moment Colonel Kozlov's salute hung in the air, time seemed to slow throughout the palace courtyard. What had been intended as a gesture of military respect between professional soldiers had suddenly become something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Sergeant Mitchell found himself at the center of a diplomatic minefield that no amount of ceremonial training had prepared him to navigate. The protocol governing the Queen's Guard during ceremonial duties was absolute and unambiguous. Guardsmen were forbidden from returning salutes from anyone other than members of the British royal family, senior British military officers in their direct chain of command, or other specifically authorized individuals. This restriction existed not from arrogance or discourtesy, but from the fundamental principle that the Guard's loyalty and recognition belonged exclusively to the crown they served. Mitchell remained frozen at attention, his mind racing through the implications of his situation. To return the colonel's salute would violate centuries of military tradition and potentially constitute an act of insubordination that could end his career. To ignore the gesture completely would constitute a diplomatic insult that could strain relations between Britain and Moldova, possibly creating international tensions that extended far beyond the palace gates. The silence in the courtyard grew heavy with tension as hundreds of observers recognized that something unexpected was occurring. The tourists beyond the gates might not have understood the specific nature of the problem, but they could sense the sudden shift in atmosphere from ceremonial pageantry to something approaching crisis. Colonel Kozlov maintained his salute, his expression showing growing confusion as the seconds passed without response. In his military experience, professional soldiers always acknowledged such gestures of respect, regardless of their national origins. The lack of reaction from Mitchell was beginning to seem less like protocol and more like deliberate discourtesy. Captain Wells found himself facing an equally difficult situation. As the commanding officer present, he was responsible for both maintaining military discipline and preserving diplomatic relations. Any intervention on his part could either resolve the situation or make it significantly worse, depending on how carefully he navigated the competing demands of tradition and diplomacy. The band members continued to hold their instruments ready, uncertain whether to resume playing or maintain silence until the unexpected situation resolved itself. Their conductor watched Captain Wells for guidance, ready to follow whatever lead might help defuse the tension that was building in the courtyard. Ambassador Petrov stepped forward slightly, his diplomatic instincts recognizing the potential for serious incident. His years of experience in international relations had taught him to identify moments when cultural misunderstanding could escalate into genuine political problems. The current situation bore all the hallmarks of such a moment. Colonel Kozlov, the ambassador, said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach his colleague without addressing the entire courtyard. Perhaps we should allow the ceremony to conclude according to British tradition. But the colonel, still maintaining his salute and growing increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as a snub, was not yet ready to withdraw his gesture. His military pride had been engaged, and he found himself unwilling to back down from what he had intended as an honor to British military excellence. Cultural attaché Volkov watched the developing situation with growing alarm, recognizing that his carefully planned cultural exchange was threatening to become an international incident. His notebook remained open in his hands, but he had stopped taking notes as the gravity of the situation became apparent. The tourists beyond the gates were beginning to murmur among themselves, their cameras still recording, but their attention focused more on the unexpected drama than on the ceremonial conclusion they had come to witness. Children asked their parents what was happening, but the adults found themselves equally uncertain about the nature of the problem they were observing. Mitchell's training as a soldier had taught him to think quickly under pressure, but the current situation presented challenges that extended far beyond military considerations. Every option available to him carried significant risks, and the consequences of his decision would extend far beyond his own career or reputation. The fundamental issue at stake was the principle of sovereignty that the Queen's Guard represented. By their very existence, the Guardsmen embodied the exclusive loyalty that British military forces owed to their sovereign. To acknowledge the authority of a foreign military officer, even in a gesture of mutual respect, would symbolically compromise that exclusive relationship. Yet Mitchell also understood the diplomatic implications of his situation. Colonel Kozlov was clearly acting from genuine respect and admiration, not from any desire to insult British traditions or challenge royal authority. The colonel's military background had led him to offer what he considered an appropriate gesture of professional recognition between soldiers. The seconds continued to pass with agonizing slowness, each moment increasing the pressure on all parties to resolve the situation before it escalated beyond control. The ceremonial schedule had been disrupted, diplomatic relations were at stake, and hundreds of observers were witnessing what threatened to become a significant international embarrassment. Captain Wells made the decision to intervene, stepping forward with careful, measured steps that would bring him within speaking distance of both the diplomatic party and his guardsmen. His years of experience had taught him that sometimes leadership required taking responsibility for difficult decisions, even when no perfect solution existed. "Colonel Kozlov," Wells said, his voice maintaining the respectful tone appropriate for addressing a foreign military officer while also carrying the authority of his position. "I appreciate your gesture of respect for our ceremonial traditions. However, our protocol requires that the ceremony conclude according to established procedures." The captain's intervention was carefully crafted to acknowledge the colonel's intentions while providing a face-saving explanation for the lack of response from Mitchell. By framing the issue as one of procedural requirements rather than personal slight, Wells hoped to defuse the tension without compromising either military discipline or diplomatic courtesy. But Colonel Kozlov was not yet ready to accept this diplomatic solution. His salute remained in place, and his expression showed growing determination rather than understanding. "Captain Wells," he replied, his voice carrying a harder edge than before, "I am offering recognition to your soldiers' excellence. Surely military courtesy transcends national boundaries." The colonel's response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that lay at the heart of the situation. In his military tradition, soldiers were expected to acknowledge respect from their professional peers regardless of nationality. The British system of absolute loyalty to the crown was foreign to his experience and seemed unnecessarily rigid. Wells recognized that the situation was escalating rather than resolving, and that more direct intervention might be required. The presence of media cameras and hundreds of witnesses meant that whatever happened next would be documented and potentially broadcast around the world. The stakes had risen beyond local embarrassment to potential international incident. "Sir," Wells said, his tone becoming more formal and authoritative, "I must respectfully request that you allow our ceremony to conclude according to British military tradition. Sergeant Mitchell is bound by protocols that govern his conduct during ceremonial duties." This explanation was more direct than the captain had hoped to provide, but the situation was moving beyond the point where diplomatic vagueness could resolve the underlying conflict. The colonel needed to understand that the issue was not personal discourtesy, but institutional obligation. Colonel Kozlov's military background had taught him to recognize authority and chain of command, but his current position as a diplomatic observer complicated his usual response to military direction. He was not subject to British military discipline, yet he was also not entirely free to ignore the requests of his hosts. The colonel finally lowered his salute, but his expression showed frustration rather than understanding. "Very well, Captain, but I must say that such rigid protocol seems unnecessarily discourteous to visitors who come in friendship and respect." The criticism stung, even though Wells understood that it arose from cultural misunderstanding rather than deliberate insult. The British ceremonial system had evolved over centuries to embody specific principles and values, but those principles could appear arbitrary or even hostile to observers from different military traditions. Ambassador Petrov moved to intervene more directly, recognizing that his colleague's frustration was threatening to create exactly the kind of diplomatic problem that their visit had been designed to prevent. "Colonel," he said firmly, "Captain Wells has explained their traditions with courtesy and clarity. We should respect their customs as we would hope they would respect ours." The ambassador's intervention carried the weight of diplomatic authority and helped to remind the colonel of his official responsibilities as a representative of his nation. Personal feelings and military pride needed to be balanced against the larger goals of maintaining positive international relationships. But the damage to the ceremony had already been done. What should have been a smooth conclusion to a routine changing of the guard had become an awkward confrontation that left all parties feeling frustrated and misunderstood. The tourists beyond the gates were beginning to sense that something had gone wrong, their excited anticipation giving way to confused uncertainty. Mitchell remained at attention throughout the exchange, his training preventing him from showing any reaction to the drama unfolding around him. But internally, he was processing the implications of what had occurred and what might happen next. The situation had tested his understanding of his duties and his loyalty to the principles he had sworn to uphold. The ceremony was eventually concluded according to established protocol, but the earlier tension had drained much of the pageantry and solemnity from the proceedings. Captain Wells gave the necessary commands, the guardsmen executed their final movements, and the outgoing unit was formally dismissed, but the atmosphere remained strained and uncomfortable. As the guardsmen began to withdraw from the courtyard, the diplomatic party prepared to depart as well. The cultural exchange that had been intended to strengthen international relationships had instead highlighted the differences and potential conflicts between military traditions from different nations. Colonel Kozlov walked in silence toward the palace exit, his earlier enthusiasm for British military pageantry replaced by frustration and a sense that he had been treated with unnecessary formality. Ambassador Petrov accompanied him with obvious concern, recognizing that his colleague's reaction could influence future diplomatic initiatives between their countries. Cultural attaché Volkov closed his notebook with a sense of uncertainty about what he would include in his report. The morning had provided insights into British military culture, but not the positive cultural exchange that had been anticipated when the visit was planned. Captain Wells watched the diplomatic party depart with mixed feelings about how the situation had been handled. His intervention had prevented the situation from escalating into open confrontation, but he was aware that the visitors were leaving with negative impressions that could influence future relationships between the military establishments of both nations. The tourists beyond the gates gradually began to disperse, their experience of British pageantry colored by the unexpected tension they had witnessed. Many would remember the ceremony not for its precision and tradition, but for the awkward moment when something had clearly gone wrong without clear explanation. Mitchell returned to barracks with his unit, but his mind remained occupied by the morning's events. The confrontation had tested every aspect of his training and understanding of his duties, forcing him to choose between competing demands of courtesy and loyalty. His decision to maintain protocol had been correct according to his training, but the diplomatic consequences remained unclear. The incident would not end with the conclusion of the ceremony. Within hours, reports of the confrontation would reach higher levels of both military and diplomatic command, setting in motion a series of discussions and evaluations that would determine whether the morning's events represented a minor cultural misunderstanding or the beginning of a more serious international problem. Within 3 hours of the ceremony's conclusion, news of the incident had reached the highest levels of both British military command and the Foreign Office. The speed with which the situation escalated from local embarrassment to international concern reflected the delicate nature of diplomatic relations in an era where cultural misunderstandings could quickly become political flashpoints. Brigadier General Sir Robert Thornfield, commanding officer of the Household Division, received his first briefing about the incident while reviewing operational reports in his London office. A veteran of 32 years of military service, Thornfield had overseen ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace for 5 years and had never faced a situation quite like the one Captain Wells described in his urgent report. The general's initial reaction was to support his officer's handling of the situation, but his years of experience in both military and diplomatic contexts made him immediately aware of the broader implications. The incident involved not just military protocol, but international relations, media attention, and the reputation of British institutions on the world stage. Give me a complete report from Captain Wells within the hour. Thornfield instructed his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Fraser. I want every detail of what happened, who was present, and what was said, and find out if there are any media recordings of the incident. Fraser, a sharp-minded officer with extensive experience in military public relations, understood immediately why the general was concerned. In the age of social media and instant global communication, even minor diplomatic incidents could escalate rapidly if they captured public attention or were misinterpreted by international audiences. Meanwhile, at the Foreign Office in Whitehall, Under Secretary of State for European Affairs David Pemberton was receiving his own briefing about the morning's events. A career diplomat with 20 years of experience in international relations, Pemberton recognized the potential for the incident to complicate Britain's relationships throughout Eastern Europe. What exactly happened? Pemberton asked his senior aide, Patricia Hawkins, as she handed him the preliminary report that had been compiled from multiple sources. According to our information, Hawkins replied, consulting her notes, the Moldovan military liaison offered a salute to one of our guardsmen during the ceremony. The guardsman didn't respond, apparently following standard protocol. The Moldovan officer took offense at what he perceived as deliberate discourtesy. Pemberton frowned as he absorbed the details. The incident represented exactly the kind of cultural misunderstanding that could damage diplomatic relationships if not handled carefully. Moldova was not a major power, but it was an important partner in European security arrangements, and any strain in bilateral relations could have broader implications. What's the Moldovan embassy's position? He asked. They haven't issued any formal statements yet, Hawkins reported. But our intelligence suggests that Colonel Kozlov has filed a report with his government expressing dissatisfaction with his treatment during the visit. At the Moldovan embassy, located in a Georgian townhouse in Belgravia, the diplomatic staff was indeed dealing with the aftermath of the morning's events. Ambassador Petrov found himself in the difficult position of managing both his colleagues' frustration and his government's expectations for the cultural exchange visit. Colonel Kozlov sat in the ambassador's private office, his earlier diplomatic composure replaced by obvious irritation. Ambassador, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, I have served my country's military for 30 years. I have represented our nation in diplomatic contexts throughout Europe. Never have I been subjected to such deliberate discourtesy. Petrov listened with growing concern, recognizing that his colleague's reaction was influenced by both personal pride and genuine cultural misunderstanding. The colonel's military background had not prepared him for the subtle complexities of British ceremonial protocol, and his interpretation of events was colored by his own expectations of military courtesy. Andrei, the ambassador said carefully, using the colonel's first name to emphasize their personal relationship, I understand your frustration, but we must consider the possibility that the British behavior reflected their own military traditions rather than deliberate insult to our nation. But Colonel Kozlov was not ready to accept such diplomatic interpretations. Their traditions, he replied sharply. What kind of tradition requires soldiers to ignore respectful gestures from allied military officers? In my experience, such behavior indicates either poor training or deliberate hostility. The colonel's reaction reflected a fundamental difference in military culture that went beyond simple protocol. In his background, military professionalism included the expectation that soldiers would acknowledge respect from their peers regardless of nationality. The British system of exclusive loyalty to the crown was not just unfamiliar to him. It seemed actively hostile to international military cooperation. Ambassador Petrov recognized that the situation required careful handling to prevent it from escalating into a formal diplomatic complaint that could strain bilateral relations. His years of diplomatic experience had taught him that personal slights, real or perceived, could sometimes create more lasting damage than substantive policy disagreements. I will contact the British Foreign Office, Petrov assured his colleague. We will seek clarification of the protocol and ensure that any misunderstanding is resolved appropriately. At Buckingham Palace, Captain Wells was completing his detailed incident report while also dealing with the immediate aftermath of the morning's events. The guardsmen under his command had performed their duties correctly, but the diplomatic tension had created an atmosphere of uncertainty about whether they might face criticism for following established protocol. Sergeant Mitchell, in particular, was struggling with the implications of his decision to maintain ceremonial discipline in the face of the colonel's salute. His military training told him he had acted correctly, but his understanding of diplomatic relations made him aware that his adherence to protocol might have broader consequences. Sir, Mitchell said to Captain Wells during their post-ceremony debriefing, did I handle the situation appropriately? I understand the diplomatic implications, but the protocol seemed clear. Wells looked at his senior non-commissioned officer with respect and understanding. Mitchell had been placed in an impossible situation and had chosen to uphold the standards he had sworn to maintain, even at considerable personal and professional risk. "Sergeant," Wells replied, "you followed your training and upheld the traditions of the Queen's Guard. The diplomatic complications are not your responsibility to resolve. You did exactly what any guardsman should do in such circumstances." But even as he reassured Mitchell, Wells was aware that higher authorities might take a different view of the situation. Military protocol and diplomatic necessity did not always align, and the ultimate judgment about the morning's events would come from officials whose priorities extended far beyond ceremonial tradition. By mid-afternoon, the incident had attracted the attention of media outlets specializing in royal and diplomatic news. While the major newspapers and television networks had not yet picked up the story, specialized journalists who covered palace events and diplomatic activities had begun to investigate what had happened during the morning ceremony. Royal correspondent Sarah Matthews, who had covered palace events for 15 years, received her first tip about the incident from a photographer who had been present at the ceremony. Matthews immediately recognized the potential significance of a story involving international diplomatic tensions at one of Britain's most famous ceremonial events. "This could be significant," Matthews told her editor at the Daily Telegraph. "Any incident involving foreign diplomats and the Queen's Guard has the potential to become a major story if it reflects broader issues in international relations." The editor, James Morrison, agreed to assign resources to investigate the story further. In an era when international tensions were constantly shifting, any incident involving British ceremonial traditions and foreign military officers could capture public attention and raise questions about diplomatic competence. At the Foreign Office, Undersecretary Pemberton was receiving updates about the developing situation from multiple sources. The Moldovan embassy had requested a meeting to discuss the morning's events, suggesting that their concerns were more serious than initially apparent. "Schedule a meeting with Ambassador Petrov for tomorrow morning," Pemberton instructed his aide, "and give me a complete briefing on British-Moldovan relations over the past 5 years. I want to understand the broader context before we address this specific incident." The request for historical context reflected Pemberton's understanding that diplomatic incidents never occurred in isolation. The colonel's reaction to the morning's events would be influenced by his overall perception of British attitudes toward his country, and any response would need to address those broader concerns as well as the immediate misunderstanding. The investigation into the incident was also beginning to reveal the complex web of expectations and assumptions that had contributed to the confrontation. Colonel Kozlov had approached the ceremony with genuine enthusiasm for British military traditions, but his own cultural background had led him to expect different forms of military courtesy than the British system provided. Similarly, the British participants had been operating according to protocols that were deeply embedded in their institutional culture, but which could appear arbitrary or even hostile to observers from different military traditions. The incident highlighted the challenges of cultural exchange in an era when traditional institutions face pressure to adapt to international expectations while maintaining their historical authenticity. As evening approached, both sides were beginning to recognize that the morning's incident had created a situation that required careful management to prevent lasting damage to diplomatic relations. The immediate confrontation had ended with the conclusion of the ceremony, but the underlying issues of cultural understanding and mutual respect remained unresolved. The British government faced the challenge of maintaining the integrity of its ceremonial traditions while demonstrating appropriate respect for international visitors and diplomatic partners. The Moldovan government needed to balance their officers' legitimate concerns about courtesy with their broader interest in maintaining positive relations with Britain. And throughout this diplomatic complexity, the guardsmen who had been at the center of the incident continued with their regular duties, knowing that their adherence to protocol had been correct according to their training, but uncertain about whether their decision would be vindicated by the ultimate resolution of the international tensions it had created. The stage was set for a diplomatic crisis that would test the ability of both governments to navigate cultural differences while maintaining the respect and cooperation that modern international relations required. The outcome would influence not only British-Moldovan relations, but also the broader question of how traditional military institutions could adapt to the expectations of an increasingly interconnected world. The incident had begun as a simple misunderstanding during a routine ceremonial event, but it was rapidly evolving into a test case for diplomatic skill, cultural sensitivity, and the challenges of maintaining historical traditions in a contemporary international context. The resolution would require wisdom, patience, and a willingness to understand perspectives that differed fundamentally from established institutional practices. The resolution of what became known as the Palace Salute incident began 48 hours after the confrontation, when Undersecretary Pemberton and Ambassador Petrov met in the Foreign Office's ornate conference room overlooking St. James's Park. Both diplomats understood that their discussion would determine whether the cultural misunderstanding would escalate into a formal diplomatic protest or be resolved through mutual understanding and compromise. Ambassador Petrov arrived at the meeting with a carefully prepared position that balanced his colleagues' concerns with his own assessment of British intentions and capabilities. His decades of diplomatic experience had taught him to distinguish between deliberate insults and cultural misunderstandings, and his investigation of the incident had convinced him that the latter explanation was more accurate. Undersecretary, Petrov began, his tone formal but not hostile. I want to express my government's concern about the treatment of Colonel Kozlov during his official visit to Buckingham Palace. The colonel is a decorated military officer whose intentions were clearly respectful, and his experience suggests a lack of appropriate diplomatic courtesy. Pemberton listened carefully, recognizing that the ambassador's words were chosen to express legitimate concerns while leaving room for constructive resolution. The diplomatic language indicated that Moldova was seeking explanation and assurance rather than confrontation, which created opportunities for positive outcomes. Ambassador, Pemberton replied, I appreciate your government's concerns, and I want to assure you that no discourtesy was intended by any British personnel. The incident appears to have resulted from differences in military protocol rather than any lack of respect for your distinguished colleague. The exchange established the framework for constructive discussion by acknowledging legitimate concerns on both sides, while avoiding accusations of deliberate wrongdoing. Both diplomats understood that their goal was to find a resolution that would satisfy their respective governments while preserving the bilateral relationship. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Brigadier General Thornfield was conducting his own review of the incident with input from military historians, protocol experts, and senior officers who had extensive experience with ceremonial duties. His investigation was designed to determine whether current protocols were appropriate for contemporary diplomatic contexts and whether modifications might be needed to prevent similar incidents. The fundamental question, Thornfield explained to his staff, is whether our traditional protocols serve their intended purpose in modern circumstances. The Queen's Guard represents the Crown's sovereignty, but we must also consider our role in supporting Britain's diplomatic objectives. The general's analysis reflected a sophisticated understanding of the competing demands facing military institutions in the 21st century. Traditional values and historical continuity remained important, but they needed to be balanced against practical requirements for international cooperation and cultural sensitivity. Captain Wells participated in these discussions, providing detailed accounts of the incident and his assessment of how the situation had developed. His perspective as the officer directly responsible for managing the confrontation was crucial for understanding both what had happened and what might be done differently in future similar situations. The colonel's intentions were clearly respectful, Wells reported. His military background led him to expect certain forms of courtesy that our protocol doesn't provide. The challenge is maintaining our traditions while acknowledging legitimate expectations from international visitors. The investigation revealed that the incident had exposed a genuine gap between British ceremonial traditions and contemporary diplomatic expectations. While the Queen's Guard's exclusive loyalty to the Crown remained an essential principle, the way that principle was expressed during public ceremonies needed to consider the presence of international observers and diplomatic guests. At the same time, Colonel Kozlov was beginning his own process of reflection and investigation into British military traditions. His initial frustration had been genuine, but his professional curiosity led him to research the historical and institutional foundations of the protocols he had encountered. The colonel's investigation revealed the deep historical roots of the Queen's Guard's ceremonial traditions and the principled reasons for their exclusive loyalty to the crown. While he continued to believe that his treatment had been unnecessarily rigid, he began to understand that the British response had reflected institutional values rather than personal discourtesy. The British system is different from ours, he acknowledged to Ambassador Petrov during one of their discussions. Their traditions appear to prioritize symbolic loyalty over international military courtesy. I still believe their approach was unnecessarily inflexible, but I can see that it was not intended as personal insult. This developing understanding created the foundation for a diplomatic resolution that would address the concerns of both sides while preserving the essential principles that each government considered important. The key was finding a way to acknowledge legitimate differences while maintaining mutual respect and cooperation. The breakthrough came when Brigadier General Thornfield proposed a meeting between military representatives from both countries to discuss ceremonial protocols and explore opportunities for enhanced understanding. The proposal recognized that the incident had revealed genuine differences in military culture that could be addressed through dialogue rather than confrontation. I believe a military-to-military discussion could clarify the principles underlying our respective traditions, Thornfield suggested to the Foreign Office. Colonel Kozlov is clearly a professional soldier who would appreciate understanding our institutional values, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with our specific protocols. The proposal appealed to both governments because it provided a face-saving mechanism for addressing the incident while creating opportunities for enhanced cooperation. For Britain, it demonstrated respect for the colonel's professional standing while maintaining the integrity of ceremonial traditions. For Moldova, it provided acknowledgement that their officers' concerns were legitimate and worthy of serious consideration. The military-to-military meeting was scheduled for the following week, with Brigadier General Thornfield and Colonel Kozlov as the primary participants. The format would allow for frank discussion of institutional differences while avoiding the formal diplomatic protocols that might limit the scope of the conversation. In preparation for the meeting, both officers conducted extensive research into each other's military backgrounds and institutional contexts. Thornfield studied the structure and traditions of Moldovan military forces, while Kozlov deepened his investigation of British ceremonial history and the constitutional role of the Queen's Guard. The research process proved valuable for both participants, providing insights that went far beyond the specific incident that had brought them together. Thornfield gained appreciation for the Central European military traditions that had shaped Kozlov's expectations, while the colonel developed understanding of the constitutional principles that governed British ceremonial practices. When the meeting finally took place, both officers approached the discussion with professional respect and genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives. The military setting allowed for direct conversation about institutional values and practical challenges without the diplomatic constraints that had limited earlier exchanges. General, Colonel Kozlov began, I want to acknowledge that my research has given me greater appreciation for the principles underlying your ceremonial traditions. While I still believe that international military courtesy should transcend national boundaries, I understand that your system reflects different constitutional arrangements. Thornfield appreciated the colonel's professional approach to the discussion. Colonel, I respect your military background and understand that your expectations were based on legitimate traditions of international military cooperation. Our challenge is finding ways to honor both our respective institutional values and our shared commitment to professional military excellence. The conversation continued for more than 2 hours, covering topics that range from constitutional theory to practical ceremonial management. Both officers found the exchange professionally rewarding and personally enlightening, discovering common ground in their shared commitment to military professionalism despite their different institutional contexts. The outcome of the military meeting provided the foundation for a broader diplomatic resolution that satisfied the concerns of both governments. A joint statement was issued acknowledging that the incident had resulted from differences in military protocol rather than intended discourtesy, while expressing mutual respect for the professional competence and good intentions of all participants. The statement also announced an exchange program that would allow military officers from both countries to observe each other's ceremonial traditions and develop enhanced understanding of institutional differences. The program would prevent similar misunderstandings while creating opportunities for professional development and international cooperation. For Sergeant Mitchell, the resolution provided vindication of his decision to maintain ceremonial protocol despite diplomatic pressure. The investigation had confirmed that his adherence to established procedures had been correct, and the broader resolution had demonstrated that institutional traditions could be maintained while accommodating international expectations. The incident taught me that military professionalism sometimes requires making difficult decisions under pressure. Mitchell reflected to Captain Wells after the resolution was announced. I'm grateful that our institutions supported the principles we've sworn to uphold while finding ways to address legitimate diplomatic concerns. Captain Wells agreed that the resolution represented the best possible outcome for all parties involved. The key lesson is that military traditions and diplomatic requirements don't have to be mutually exclusive. The challenge is finding ways to honor both sets of obligations while maintaining the integrity of our institutional values. The broader impact of the incident extended beyond the immediate resolution to influence how both British and international military establishments approach ceremonial interactions. The case became a teaching example in military education programs, illustrating the complexities of maintaining traditional values in contemporary international contexts. For the diplomatic community, the incident demonstrated the importance of cultural preparation and institutional understanding in international exchanges. The resolution showed that even significant cultural misunderstandings could be addressed constructively when all parties approach the situation with professional respect and genuine willingness to understand different perspectives. The Palace Salute incident ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the relationship between Britain and Moldova, creating opportunities for enhanced cooperation and mutual understanding that extended far beyond military ceremonies. The resolution proved that diplomatic skill, cultural sensitivity, and institutional integrity could work together to transform potential conflicts into opportunities for enhanced international cooperation. Years later, the incident would be remembered not as a diplomatic failure, but as an example of how professional military officers and skilled diplomats could navigate cultural differences to achieve outcomes that honored the legitimate interests and values of all parties involved. The resolution demonstrated that tradition and innovation, institutional loyalty, and international cooperation could coexist when managed with wisdom, patience, and mutual respect.